We're going to read Daniel chapter 1. So if you have a Bible, you might like to turn there. Let's hear God's word. Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why would he see you looking worse? Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Let's just have some time to think about this chapter, shall we, and see what God is saying to us this evening. Murray, can you advance onto the first slide? My phone is failing to connect to Proclaim, so I can't control the presentation. Okay. So the first thing I want you to see from chapter 1 is that God is in control in what seems to be very wrong circumstances. Look at chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes and besieges Jerusalem. Jerusalem is God's holy city. Jerusalem is the place which should reflect God's glory. Israel should be the place which, if they are following God, 10 men will chase away 1,000. And yet here, as Nebuchadnezzar comes to besiege, he captures the city and he plunders the temple. He takes away items from the temple of God and puts them in the treasure house of his God. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you'd immediately think of the Ark of the Covenant being taken into Philistine territory, and as it's placed in Dagon's temple, Dagon's statue falls over and smashes, and you think, yes. But not this time. It's all wrong. And yet, can you see in the middle of that, verse 2, the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. It's God's doing. You'll know as you read through the Old Testament that this is God's judgment on the people's wickedness. They had failed to follow God as they ought. They continued to ignore his word and his prophets, and they'd continued in their sin and worship of false gods. And so this is the deliberate and righteous judgment of God on his wicked people, that they are defeated and the exile begins. But God is in control. And it's a message that's consistent through Scripture. Kingdoms come and kingdoms go, and God raises them and God takes them down, and God is in control. And that's important for us in our current moment. As we look around and we perhaps despair at the place of the church in our culture today and what's going on in the West, and it's an abandonment of God's morality, we need to remember that God is in control. That these moments aren't accidents. They're not somehow the plot going wrong. God is in control. He's working his purposes out in his times, and we need to hold on to that. We might get very disorientated by what's going on. We might feel as though we're losing our way and we don't understand why it's happening, but God is in control. And we need to hold on to that. So that's the first thing. Secondly, verses 3 to 7, look at the pressure then that is placed on these young men particularly to conform in a foreign culture. Nebuchadnezzar orders Ashpenaz to bring from Israel some of the royal family and nobility, some of the most promising individuals amongst God's people. They are to look good, they are to have high performance indicators, and they are then to be brought into the king's service, verse 3. Verse 5, to enter the king's service. God's people not serving their king, but the foreign invader's king. And not only serving the foreign invader's king, but taken to a foreign land. Why can't we just have the map? Just think for a moment how disorientating it is for Ukrainian refugees. People whose land is a war zone and they've been brought over to the UK. English is not their mother tongue. And they're landed in some community in a house with hosts that they can't communicate properly with. In a bureaucracy they don't understand, a long way from home, probably a long way from other friends and family, and you'll get something of what must have felt for Daniel and these other young men, the first amongst many exiles who head to Babylon, so far from home, so foreign in every way as a culture to what they are used to. But look at the particular pressure that's placed on Daniel and his friends. Next slide, Murray, thanks. Can you see in verse 4, they are to be taught the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now, it was vitally important for Jewish households to teach their children and all members of the household the word of God, to be soaked in it, to learn it. Do you remember Deuteronomy 6? So that as you go out and about your business, it's there, you know it. But now, they are to be taught the language and literature of the Babylonians, a foreign language. And foreign literature, which would have included all the mythologies and the religion of the many gods of the Babylonians. And a ethic which would have been totally foreign to them. In verse 5, they are to be trained for 3 years in these things, immersed totally in this culture. So they're being isolated from their home. They've been taken away from the normal and placed in a new place. They're now being indoctrinated with a whole new language and literature. And then they're being immersed into a whole different culture. Verse 5, they receive food from the king's table. They've gone from the Jewish diet, which marked them out as God's people, and they are being immersed in the food and the culture of this foreign land. And then finally, just to almost completely eradicate any sense of their identity as God's people, verse 7, their names are changed. Names which in their language reflected their God. Every time you read a name in the Old Testament with E-L in, L, that's God. And so Daniel has got God in his name. And so has Mishael. And yet now they're given new names which reflect the Babylonian gods and the Babylonian culture. Massive pressure to conform. And folks, I think in a way that those of us who are older and look back on previous decades can say that things now, the pressure to conform to a non-Christian culture, the recognition that we are exiles in a foreign country is greater than ever. Many Christians, many churches have been left behind as the culture has changed, and people feel very discombobulated, very disconnected, and trying to work out how do we remain faithful in this when all this is happening. There's all the questions about should we send our kids to the local schools because of what they'll get taught and how they'll be indoctrinated. There's a whole issue of language now where the language we use in here it's not even in the vocabulary of the people out there. Concepts and things that we believe that just don't resonate with people out there. And there's all this pressure. And we're trying to work that out. It's a very different place to where things were in previous generations in this country. And in the middle of all this time of what seems like disaster, though God is in control, and this time of pressure to conform to a foreign culture, thirdly, Mari, we have a vital resolve. Can you see in verse 8? But Daniel resolved. In all that's changing, in all the pressures there are, Daniel sets out to do something. And can you see what is described there as his resolve? In verse 8, it's mentioned twice. He resolves not to defile himself. He asks the chief official for permission not to defile himself. He wants to live in this culture, but in a way that doesn't defile himself as one of God's people. Now, where would he start? Which issue would he pick? How dare you change my name and take my God out of it? I think I would have been pretty miffed if that had happened. That's part of my identity. That's part of my identity as a child of God. It's part of where I've come from. How dare you change my name? Names are so personal, aren't they? Who said you can change my name? He doesn't take up that issue. He doesn't say, how dare you take me from my home? I'm off. We don't read The Great Escape here, do we? Daniel doesn't spend the next however long intending to get out. That was the kind of British officer's resolve, wasn't it, in the Second World War? I have a duty to my country to escape from the prisoner of war camp. I'm not promising not to try. Or so say the great films that celebrate those things. But Daniel doesn't do that. Nor does he say, I'm not learning what you want to teach. I don't believe your myths. Really? You expect me to invest time in learning about your gods that are no gods? He doesn't take up any of those issues. Instead, he resolves not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. It raises the question, why that issue? Why of all the issues does he go for the diet? And the honest answer is, we don't actually know. And the commentators come up with all sorts of suggestions. Is it the fact that he's being asked to eat non-kosher stuff, things that are forbidden in the Old Covenant? Well, there's no indication here. The indication is it's royal food and wine, that's all. Is it food that's been sacrificed to a foreign god? Is that the issue? Well, then why would he eat the vegetables and not the rest if it's all part of that celebration? The bottom line is we don't actually know what was so defiling about the food. There's no indication given in the text. But what is clear is that Daniel is resolved not to be defiled in the midst of this. He is not allowing himself to be so sucked into this new culture that he loses his identity as God's child. He's prepared to be in this culture, and he's prepared for his name to be changed and to learn their stuff and to serve their king and to be in a foreign land. But he's not going to be defiled in all of that. And how does Daniel go about this resolve? What does faithfulness to God in a foreign culture look like in terms of manner? Does Daniel say, how dare you take away my rights? I'm on hunger strike. I'm not eating that stuff because I'm faithful to God. No. Daniel, can you see in verse 8? Ask for permission. It's fascinating, isn't it? And when that official is too frightened of the king to give Daniel permission, even though this official has been showing favor and compassion to Daniel, because God has caused that, Daniel then goes down a layer to the guard whom that official has appointed over them. And what does he say? Please test your servants for 10 days. Look, I know your neck is on the line for how we come out of this. I know that it will cost you if we go on hunger strike or if we don't eat the food and we look shabby. I know we are your responsibility, so can we arrange a test? Can you let us do this for 10 days? And see how it works. Daniel's gentle, he's understanding, he's asking permission, he's finding a way that doesn't cost the men who've got responsibility for him. And this official agrees to the test for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they look better than everybody else. So the official's more than happy for Daniel not to defile himself with the food and wine, whatever that means for Daniel. Because actually, he looks better. And so Daniel's got this resolve not to be of the world in which he is now living in. But he goes about that resolve in a gentle manner. Carefully, kindly, asking for permission, being willing to have it tested to show that it works. So we've got God in control of what seems to be such a rubbish situation. God is in control of our times. There's this huge pressure to conform to a foreign culture, which we experience too. And then for Daniel, there's a vital resolve. It's not entirely clear as to why he lets some things ride over him and stands on this particular issue, but the way in which he does it and his manner is important as he seeks not to be defiled. And then finally we see in verses 17 to 21, God honors their faithfulness. Daniel's resolve not to be defiled is honored by God as God gives these four men, verse 17, knowledge and understanding. And actually, when it comes to the exams, there's no one like them. God equips them above others to enter, verse 19, the king's service, the king of the foreign culture. And they're 10 times better than everyone else, verse 20. And verse 21, Daniel's there for the whole reign of Nebuchadnezzar. For the whole era of this foreign ruler, Daniel is in his service. Daniel is not defiled. Daniel is faithful because God honors Daniel. He remains faithful throughout that whole era. And it's a reminder, I think, even at the start of the book, as we head for some fairly hair-raising stories about the cost of faithfulness, that it's only an era. Daniel's there, verse 21, till the first year of Cyrus. And then the rest of the book is going to be about all those intervening details, but it's almost as though right at the beginning we're told, this is only one king. He's going to reign for a while, and then it will pass. And in our era, with the church in its current state and the land in its current state and the culture we're finding ourselves in their current state, God enables us to be faithful. He honors faithfulness in this culture.